Welcome in another week. Michigan recruiting 4th and 1 here on WXYZ.com. I'm Brett Galli, joined as always by Tom VH. You're outclassing me today.
Well, you have the tie. We balance each other out.
It's about half a tie. As someone said out there, is that dental floss or a tie? It's a tie. Michigan, another rough week. The first loss under Brady Hoke at Michigan Stadium. Signs pointing to just a year that has become more troubling and more troubling. Last week it was execution. This week Hoke takes the blame. As one of your colleagues at ESPN, Chantel Jennings, wrote, it wasn't all Hoke.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the biggest problem. There are so many questions, Tom.
Yeah, and I think that's the troubling part for Michigan fans to watch this is there isn't one answer of how to fix it. You know, a lot of people are blaming Al Borges, a lot of people are blaming the offensive line, but I think it's really a combination of a whole lot of different things that has combined into what it is now.
As always, at home games, recruits are on hand. We'll start off with our first down. The first loss, as I said, under Brady Hoke as the head coach at Michigan. That's impactful when you have recruits in-house.
Right.
Who was in town, who was watching, and what kind of impact did that loss have as they're sitting there watching?
Well, one of the bigger visitors was actually a commit, Drake Harris, who I know you're familiar with. A lot of people recently had there was some concerns with the commitments, with the losing, if a lot of those guys were going to stick with their commitment. And he was on campus this weekend, and I think that was a big deal to give Michigan fans a little bit of a sigh of relief.
Yeah.
I talked to him after the game and said, where's your head at? Where are the commitments at as far as this season and the future? And he said everything's going to be okay. He reiterated what the coaches have said. It's a young team. He knows that. He sees an opportunity to play early potentially, and he knows that the youth is eventually going to develop, and they'll be fine in the future. Those were his words. So I think that was a positive for Michigan fans to see a guy like Drake Harris, in-state commit, who was once committed to Michigan State, say that everything's going to be okay. And he's actually an early enrollee, and there's I say new rule loosely. It's a rule that is just now being implemented more. With early enrollees, they're now allowed to sign financial aid agreements, get those into the school, and the school can acknowledge those recruits as if it was National Signing Day. Oh. So he's signed those papers. He's going to enroll early. He's saying everything's going to be fine. I think that's a big deal for Michigan fans.
Well, when you look at it, a lot of these kids, we've talked all the time about the concern. In the back of their mind, even in the forefront, they see a team with talent, and they also see an opportunity. Bottom line for them, they want to play. Drake Harris wants to play, sees an opportunity. He's thinking in his head, I'm the best player on this team next year at the wide receiver position.
Well, yeah, and that's the good thing about recruiting top-rated players, some of the best players. They have that mentality. They think they can come in right away and play. And so the youth aspect of it, or the play on the field with this type of team for those kind of kids isn't as big of a concern for maybe other prospects.
We've talked now, we'll move on to second down, about the impact of one loss, one bad performance, the in-state loss to Michigan State. You've said all along it doesn't have a big deal in recruiting. It hasn't impacted recruiting that much. A season of losing and a downward spiral, as we've seen, is it having an impact now?
Not yet. And I think the yet is important there because there's different aspects to this, and losing and having a losing season. Michigan still has a tough road to go. They have Northwestern, Iowa, and Ohio State. Ohio State's going to be a very tough game for them, even though it's at home. They still have a long ways to go. So if they start to fall again in these last 3 games, then you're going to have other programs come in. And this is where it gets to be a little bit tricky, and it gets to be where it can impact kids, because you're going to have other programs who were recruiting those kids before they committed. Those coaches are going to come in and say, that team's losing. They're not going anywhere. They're not developing their kids. They're not. All of those questions that those kids have, they're going to be brought up by the other coaches. So that's kind of when you have to really look at the commits, look at the kids that Michigan's going after, and see how it'll impact them. And they have all the time in the world once the season ends. They're not doing a lot but sitting around. So I think once the season is over, that's when we'll see if it's really going to start impacting these kids.
Hoke's rule, is it written, unwritten? Is it a verbal thing where he says if you verbally commit, you can't take other visits? Is that right?
Yeah, and that policy has it's been scrutinized. It's been overlooked by the fans, and basically what it is once you commit, once you give your verbal commitment to Michigan, if you take a visit to another school, they don't consider you committed to Michigan anymore. And that's happened in the past. Farrell Brown from Oregon, Farrell Brown was a tight end. He was committed to Michigan, ended up going to Oregon. David Dawson, he was committed to Michigan initially, took a visit to Florida, then recommitted to Michigan, and now he's a Wolverine. So yeah, that comes into play here. We'll see what happens, especially once the season is over. Like I said, they'll have time to take visits if they want to.
All right, well, the big excitement stirring in recruiting this week is Deshan Han. I've been following you closely on Twitter with all the updates that you've had. You can follow Tom on Twitter at TomVH. You keep it simple there with a nice handle.
I do.
What hasn't been simple is what's been going on with Deshan Han, because he's kept everything, as you've pointed out, very within.
Yep.
He makes his decision this week. What's the latest?
Well, we know it's down to Alabama, Florida, and Michigan, and that's pretty much all everyone knows right now. I remember vividly when, in the beginning of this process, when we spoke, I talked to him and I was asking him all kind of questions, and something that stood out to me was he mentioned a couple times. He said, "I want everybody to be in suspense. I don't want anybody to know where I'm going when I decide." And he's done that. I think as of right now, I think a lot of people are leaning towards he'll probably pick Michigan, but I don't know that any reporters, including myself, I don't know that we're ready to go out on a limb and say this is where I think he's going. Now that can change. If he starts telling coaches, whenever he starts telling coaches, I'm not coming here, I'm not coming there, or if he tells that school, I am coming here, that could leak out. That could start to get the word out. But as of right now, yeah, it's anyone's guess, just because he did take those visits to Alabama and Florida. He's been to Michigan quite a few times. I still, if I had to guess, I still want to say Michigan at this point, but like I said, I'm not willing to put a stamp on it.
You've got everyone on the edge of their seats, and every time I walk around, I'm in Ann Arbor for the games, I'm walking around the streets, people say, "What's the latest with Deshan Han? I saw you guys and Tom talking about it." And we walked in today and said, we talk about Deshan every week, but we've got to talk about him because people want to know.
Right. Yeah, and he's a big-time prospect. That's, the people want the big kids. And when you get a kid like this, a kid from Virginia, outside the Midwest, someone being recruited by Alabama and Florida, if you can beat those schools for this kind of kid and add him to your defensive line, that's a big deal. So it's no wonder that they're interested. This is the kind of kid that could come in, especially within Greg Madison's defense in a 4-3 scheme. I think he could fit as a strong side defensive end. He can bring a pass rush element to the defense, something they're lacking right now. So there's a wide variety of reasons why people are watching this so closely.
The Michigan coaches are there. Obviously, they're in suspense just like the rest of us. We'll move on to fourth down and talk about the contingency plan if Han doesn't choose Michigan, because I'm sure the coaches have one. If he does choose, what happens next with this class? How will they fill those last few spots?
Well, he's a big piece to the rest of this class, and there are only a few spots left. So if he does pick Michigan, then you're looking at Malik McDowell is obviously one of the bigger targets left on the board, the defensive lineman from Southfield. It looks like he's going to take his time. So there's going to be a while. He might announce at the Army All-American game. He might take some official visits down to the South. And then outside of that, it's kind of a toss-up. They were interested in safety John Juju Smith. I love that nickname. He's from California. He canceled his official visit. He was going to come out for the Ohio State game. He canceled that, so he's no longer an option as of right now. Okay. So I think there's a few different ways that they could go. If they wanted to target another running back, if they wanted to target another athlete, a safety, I think there's a few different ways that they could go if they wanted to fill this class out.
When you look at what is there at running back, with Derek Green still standing there, everything else, it is an attractive option. I think anytime someone hears an offensive skill position like that, with the names out there, what would they be looking for? Who would they be looking at? Are there names at the forefront?
Yeah, there are a few, and this is all contingent on a lot of things, and it's dependent on a few things too. I don't think it's set in stone that they'll go after a running back. If they decided to, there's a kid named Kalen Ballage out of Colorado. Michigan's been recruiting him for a while. They seem to be in his top group. And then there's a guy that I really like out of Minnesota, Jeff Jones. He's committed to Minnesota right now, but he's been hearing a lot from a couple different schools, including Michigan State. A couple Big Ten schools have been in his ear. He rushed for over 40 touchdowns this season.
Wow.
We just bumped him up into the ESPN 300. He's a guy that if I was a coach, I would go after him. He might get his name called if they decide to go after that position.
Interesting. On our extra point, we usually save that for a Michigan freshman doing well on the field. A little bit of a tough time finding that this week. But even that being said, I did want to take some time to talk about the article you posted on ESPN.com. Very well written. A lot of research. I know you've been talking about that for weeks, putting that together.
Yep.
Give people the story, the background of it all. It was basically the struggles and what student athletes in Detroit public school system have to go through in the college recruiting process.
Yeah, and not just the recruiting process, just in life. It was so interesting. I've been working on this for, I think, over 3 months now, just gathering info, talking to people, and basically what I wanted to show people was there are struggles in Detroit, and there are a lot of negatives in the city of Detroit right now, but there's also a lot of positives. And the high school coaches, we covering recruiting around this area, we see it all the time. The high school coaches drive these kids to camps, and not just local camps, to Alabama, to Florida. They spend their own money. One of the coaches at King, he said they get paid $500 a season, and he's spent already just this year $10,000 of his own money on these kids. Some of the coaches are giving shelter to these kids if they don't have a place to stay for the night. J. Rue Campbell was the main feature. He's a quarterback in the 2015 class for Detroit Cass Tech, and he spoke to me so maturely about his situation, and it was for any other person it would probably be so devastating or so depressing. He talked about how his father was in jail for most of his life, how he doesn't really feel safe at his house. And he just kind of said it so matter-of-factly, and how his coaches have brought him up, how they've given him security and safety and a father figure. So the whole thing was interesting. It's really depressing and sad to hear it, but it's so uplifting to hear that these coaches are doing such great things for these kids.
I know when I went to Cass Tech and visited with them right before the actual practice schedule started, Thomas Wilcher, their head coach, was sleeping at the school with the kids just to make sure they were all in-house, a place to stay, ready to practice.
Yeah.
Just because he said, I don't know if they'll be able to get here for training camp practices. He said in the past, kids just wouldn't show up because they didn't have a ride. They had no way of getting there. The public transportation system you can't rely on in Detroit.
Yep.
So he just said, this is the constant way to do it. We make it fun. You wake up early in the morning together. But you don't have that at other schools. This he had to do, he felt, to keep everyone there.
Oh, yeah. And it's not just to get them to camp. It's to keep them safe.
Right.
And that's the main thing to hear the coaches talk about why they do it too, because Thomas Wilcher doesn't have to sleep there.
No.
He has his own family. He has kids of his own, and they're sacrificing so much to hear why they do it. That was my biggest question was why do you guys do this for so little money? What's in it for you? And he said, all the coaches said, because someone did it for me. When they were growing up, someone was there for them to help them and get them to a point of success, and that was the biggest thing for them, is that they're teaching these kids, once they make it, however they define that, however they define success, once they make it, they have to come back and help at least one kid, and that's how they're going to break the chain. So that was very impactful to hear that, and I'm just glad that I got to be a part of it.
Yeah, well, kudos to you for putting it out there and shining light on these coaches, these athletes, and these students, and overall people. So if you haven't read it, it's on ESPN.com. A lot of Tom's stuff you have to pay for, even though it's worth it on ESPN. This one is free, and it's worth picking up. It's all over Twitter. It's all over the internet. Find it. Very well written. Tom, thanks for your insight as always.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, man. Follow him on Twitter, Tom VH. I'm at Brad Galli. This is 4th and 1 Michigan Recruiting, as always, every week on WXYZ.com.